Hello, everyone. I'm Rick Shweder. I'm a cultural anthropologist and cultural psychologist in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. My talk today is titled "The Value of Anthropology," for example, in raising doubts about the prosecution of Duwodi Bora mothers. This talk is basically about the scope and limits of tolerance for cultural diversity in liberal democracies. Over the past several decades, I've been studying the moral foundations of diverse cultural traditions, both liberal and illiberal. The anthropology of morality is, at least in part, the study of what members of different moral heritage traditions think and mean when they express their approval of a behavior and judge it to be right and good, or when they express their disapproval of a behavior and judge it to be wrong and bad, or even very bad, like wicked, sinful, or evil. There is more than a little irony in this type of anthropological calling. Many of the communities studied by cultural anthropologists are quite illiberal. Their members feel viscerally attached to their own particular historical ethical community, grounded in its own identity-defining metaphysical beliefs and legends or origin stories. These are communities where members draw strong in-group versus out-group distinctions, do not believe there but for fortune goes you or goes I, do believe that gods, goddesses, and the spirits of the dead play a continuing part in human history, feel duty-bound to live up to the briefs for behavior distinctive of their social status within their community, which are often embedded in hierarchical, interdependent patron-client relationships, and frequently discriminate in favor or against other individuals on the basis of sex, age, kinship, ethnicity, and religion. While many of the cultural anthropologists who study those illiberal traditions are themselves quite liberal, and tend to equate the moral domain with values such as individual autonomy, non-discrimination, justice, equality, and freedom of choice. The cultural anthropologist, whose own moral thinking is steeped in a liberal ethics of autonomy, seeks to understand and fairly represent the way of life of a people whose moral thinking is rooted in an ethics of community and an ethics of divinity. It's quite a challenge. In rising to that challenge, how good are anthropologists at answering normative questions about the scope and limits of tolerance for cultural diversity on either a global or domestic scale? For example, what do anthropologists who study morality or religion or social norms have to say about the scope of tolerance in their own country for a cultural practice such as a long-standing, gender-equal, religiously based Muslim version of the ancient Jewish Abrahamic circumcision tradition? I'll return to this thought-provoking example in a moment and use it as an illustration today of the moral challenge of multiculturalism in a liberal democracy such as my own. For much of the 20th century, an introductory cultural anthropology course, at least in the United States, was meant to be an antidote to ethnocentrism and a challenge to imperial up-from-barbarism, where developed you're not, West is best thinking. That was its value, that was its telos. Its aim was to promote social intelligence in a world of plural beliefs, ideologies, values, and ways of life. Its mission, a classically liberal one, is to expand scope of toleration for cultural and civilizational differences. Its message to its practitioners went something like this: nature, human rationality, and the rules of moral reason leave plenty of room for cultural variety. So strive in your ethnographic research to verify the reality, validity, and intelligibility of values, beliefs, and ways of life different from your own. My presentation today will address two questions. The first question: how does that pluralistic ideal for anthropology, the one I just mentioned, compare to three other contemporary conceptions offered by anthropologists about their discipline's value? Namely, first, a conception of anthropology as a positive science seeking to discover how the world works. Secondly, a conception of anthropology as a skeptical postmodern discipline, unmasking and deconstructing claims to objective knowledge as reified ideologies, expressing and sustaining oppressive and discriminatory dominance relationships. And thirdly, a conception of anthropology as a platform for a moral discourse, providing support, for example, to social justice movements and identity politics. The second closely related question is this: to what extent is the discipline of anthropology able to address normative questions about the scope and limits of tolerance for cultural diversity in liberal democracies? Highlighted as a test case will be the recent prosecutions of Muslim mothers of the Dawoodi Bohra religious community, who've been under attack in the United States, India, and Australia because they customarily adhere to a religiously based, gender-inclusive version of the ancient Jewish Abrahamic circumcision tradition. In other words, in Dawoodi Bohra families, it's not only boys, but also girls who are circumcised, and it's mothers who typically control and arrange for the circumcision of their daughter. This longstanding gender-inclusive circumcision tradition, known as kafs or khatna when referring to females, is religiously meaningful for some, although not all, denominations of Muslims around the world. The history and religious foundations of the custom have been described and documented in a 2019 report by the English barrister Zimran Samuel, which also includes a first of its kind representative survey of current Dawoodi Bohra female opinion about the practice. As Mr. Samuel discovered, the custom has widespread contemporary female support in the Dawoodi Bohra community, even among highly educated professional women, of whom there are many. Globally, the Dawoodi Bohra religious community has approximately 1 million members. The global community has a clerical hierarchy and a supreme religious leader whose spiritual status in the eyes of its members resembles that of the Pope for the global Catholic community. The central religious and administrative offices of the denomination, its Vatican, so to speak, are located in Mumbai. The Dawoodi Bohra are a small, highly educated and cosmopolitan Shia Muslim denomination that has distinguished itself with their gender egalitarian orientation to education and the high participation of women in various professional occupations. I mention this last fact mindful of the neo-colonial sounding discourse of disparagement, condescension, and denial of women's agency frequently employed by global activists who campaign against gender-inclusive circumcision traditions in Africa and Asia. These campaigners are reluctant to allow that when a mother supports the circumcision of her daughter as well as her son, it's a meaningful act that she does for justifiable reasons. Instead, these campaigners believe that any mother who adheres to the custom is either A, uneducated and ignorant of the consequences of the custom, B, a slave of a tradition she herself would like to escape if only she had the option, or C, oppressed and under the thumb of the deplorable men in her family who wish to control their wives and daughters and deprive them of any sexual enjoyment in life. Or I suppose there's also D, that she herself is deplorable. By way of contrast, most Dawoodi Bohra women, including those who are highly educated health professionals, appear to embrace female circumcision with their eyes open. Right now, Dawoodi Bohra women are under global attack. In the United States and Australia, there have been interrogations, arrests, child protective service trials aimed at separating mothers from their own children and canceling their parental rights, and indictments by prosecutors who hope to convict Dawoodi Bohra mothers of a crime. In India, the Supreme Court has received the so-called public interest litigation writ petition against the Dawoodi Bohra custom submitted by a children's rights advocate. The petition assails the female, but not the male side of the Dawoodi Bohra circumcision tradition, and calls on the court to require ministries and state governments of India to ban the practice. In the United States, the prosecutions can be dated to April 12, 2017. Dr. Jumana Nagarwala, a 44-year-old native-born American physician trained at Johns Hopkins Medical School, a mother of 4 children and an admired member of the Duoti Bora religious community who performed circumcisions at a local medical clinic, was arrested by the FBI in the Eastern District of the state of Michigan. She was charged with female genital mutilation under a 1996 federal statute by that name and accused of conspiring to transport children across state lines to commit a sexual offense and making false statements to a federal agent. Bail was denied by a magistrate judge and she was consigned to captivity in a Michigan jail. A federal criminal trial was scheduled, the first of its kind under that statute, and a separate state of Michigan Child Protection Services petition was filed in Wayne County, seeking to terminate her parental rights. Other Duoti Bora women as well were indicted, including several mothers whose daughters had been circumcised by Dr. Nagarwala. The legal case, which is moribund but still alive, has gone through several twists and turns. In Australia, the prosecution of Duoti Bora women can be dated to 2015. A Duoti Bora mother who was a pharmacist living and working in Sydney, her female circumciser, and her local religious leader were indicted, tried, and convicted of female genital mutilation, quote unquote, under a statute very similar to the US law. The mother served her sentence under house arrest. Ultimately, the convictions were appealed, and that case too has had its twists and turns. Legal assaults of this type, focused exclusively on the female side of a gender-inclusive custom, have seemed unfair, inconsistent, or even hypocritical to some. Activists opposed to childhood male circumcision, for example, as routinely practiced by Jews and Muslims, often refer to the procedure as, quote unquote, male genital mutilation, and view the procedure as a type of assault or violations of the autonomy and physical integrity of the male child. They argue that there should be equal protection before the law, regardless of sex or gender. In 2010, the Royal Dutch Medical Association issued a report titled Non-Therapeutic Circumcision of Male Minors, striving to be gender equal and hence consistent in their policy recommendations concerning non-medical genital procedures in childhood. They called on Jews and Muslims in Holland to abandon their customary practice of male circumcision. That perception of unfairness, inconsistency, or hypocrisy is there as well in the eyes of those who argue for liberal pluralism and tolerance of diverse cultural and religious traditions. By most accounts, the Duoti Bora circumcision procedure for girls amounts to a nick, abrasion, piercing, or small cut restricted to the female foreskin or prepuce, often referred to as the clitoral hood, or in some parts of Southeast Asia as the clitoral veil. From a strictly surgical point of view, the custom is less invasive than a typical male circumcision, as routinely and customarily performed by Jews and Muslims everywhere in the world, and is currently legally practiced in India, the United States, and Australia. So the question arises, if the practice is legal for boys, why should it be banned for the girls? So how good are anthropologists, qua anthropologists, at answering normative questions about the scope and limits of tolerance for cultural diversity on a global or domestic national scale? For example, when asked to faithfully represent and evaluate customs such as a long-standing gender equal Abrahamic circumcision tradition. Let me circle around that question for a moment before taking it up in what will be the second part of my talk today, by acknowledging that the type of normative question I'm raising here, how much cultural diversity ought to be possible within the confines of this or that particular country, is not the type of question that anthropologists are accustomed to systematically analyzing. Of course, many anthropologists hold strong personal views on the topic, and it's probably the case that most non-anthropologists assume that most anthropologists have high regard for cultures other than their own, and are prepared to offer a defense of other ways of life against any attempt by dominant cultural groups to cleanse their domestic landscape of cultural differences, or to succumb to what Clifford Geertz once described as, quote unquote, a drive towards a destructive integrity. That assumption, however, is not necessarily correct, as we shall see in the second part of this talk. So how good are anthropologists at addressing and answering normative questions about the scope and limits of tolerance for cultural diversity on either a global or domestic scale? Do they have a professional framework for making comparative moral judgments? If so, is it well-grounded? Let's have a look around within American cultural anthropology and see what we find. Within the discipline of anthropology, there are plenty of activists involved in the international human rights movement. The use of a discourse of human rights within anthropology is complex, and that discourse is by no means consistent, rigorous, or intellectually coherent. Nevertheless, among contemporary anthropologists in Europe and the United States, there are human rights activists who reject the notion of group rights or parental rights or rights to local self-determination and are quite suspicious of the idea of a basic right to culture. They're far more interested in the application of some notion of universal individual rights to save the children of other cultures from their own parents and to legitimize humanitarian interventions by international organizations. They want to use the idea of universal human rights to protect individuals, especially women and children, from cultural practices that are thought to be patriarchal, oppressive, harmful, or inequitable in some regard. These cultural practices include, for example, polygamy, bride price, arranged marriage, veiling, the sequestering or seclusion of females, physical punishment or shaming of children, choreographed adolescent initiation ordeals, and the general procedures associated with gender identity ceremonies, adult initiation, and even alternative ideals of genital beauty in some parts of East and West Africa. Such human rights activists can be quite scornful of other cultures and may even be interested in sanctioning or criminalizing those who engage in what they take to be, quote unquote, barbaric practices, what during the colonial era were called heathen practices, and today are called harmful traditional practices. So there are at least some anthropologists these days embracing one form or other of what was once called the civilizing project. They're quite liberationist and interventionist in orientation and prepared to define agency as opposition to received traditions and to contrast culture with human rights. The idea that there's some kind of inherent opposition between rights and cultures has gained some currency in academic and advocacy literatures in recent years. I confess I don't find the proposed opposition appealing or even coherent. If there actually are real, objective, natural, or inalienable human rights, for example, a right to freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, or the rights of parents to educate their children into the beliefs and values of a particular way of life, the way of life of their ancestors, then the very process of group and family formation and the entire symbolic and expressive side of culture might well rest on them and might be well justified by reference to some set of human rights. On the other hand, if real, objective, natural, or inalienable human rights don't exist, as some have argued, then they can hardly be said to be in tension or conflict with culture. And if they exist only as so-called positive rights, rights granted by consensus or declaration or promulgation by some groups at some points in history, but not by other groups at other points in history. In other words, if they are understood to be convention-based, vote-based, or alienable rights, then it's one's particular location in culture and history that's the only source of authority for any claim to have a right. So I don't find the opposition of rights versus culture very helpful. What is a real, natural, objective, or inalienable human right? Presumably, it's something to which everyone is entitled simply by virtue of being a human being. If that is the case, then it's an entitlement that derives not from who you are in particular or from what you have accomplished in life. And it's not an entitlement whose authority derives from the will of some person or group who decides and elects to honor the things called rights. A natural or inalienable right in the strong sense must be something transcendental or overarching, something that we may discover, but not something we simply make up or invent, either individually or collectively. For then the right would be subjective, not objective. And if the right is not objective, it would not be universally binding, nor would it provide a non-ethnocentric basis for drawing moral maps of the cultures of the world. Additionally, moving around within American cultural anthropology, there are significant theoretical currents and principled positions running against the professional posing of questions about the legitimate scope for cultural tolerance. One such current, the neo-positivists in anthropology, might well reject the question precisely because it is normative rather than empirical. Stay away from moral or normative questions about what ought to be, the principled positivists might declare, for such questions are outside the realm of any anthropologist's scientific competence. You can't go from what is to what ought to be, she or he might say. Another current, the skeptical postmodernists, post-culturalists, anti-culturalists in anthropology, have in so many ways, and by now for so many years, been calling for a deeply corrosive reading of all representations of others. They've raised doubts about the reality and existence of bounded groups under the banner of a critique of essentialism or monumentalism or orientalism, or of just plain stereotyping. They have become critical of all attempts to portray members of other cultures with any characteristic face. The skeptical postmodernists or post-culturalists have been working very hard to subjectivize or dissolve the very ideas of ethnic group identity and of objective ethical truth. At this point, one can hardly expect them to see the point of actually trying to give an answer to moral questions about how much cultural diversity ought to be allowed within the confines of, for example, the liberal democratic nation states, such as the United States, India, or Australia. Nevertheless, in our current multicultural world, that is the kind of question that anthropologists, at least those who continue to be pro-cultural and care about the traditions of ethnic and religious minority groups, are going to have to address more and more, if for no other reason than the fact that in a multicultural world, cultures sometimes collide, often to the detriment of immigrant minority groups. And when those collisions take place, for example, between peoples who circumcise their children and those who don't, one is bound to ask, are the different kinds of moral heritage traditions studied by anthropologists different but equal? Let's call this the pluralist interpretation of difference. Or are they different but unequal, and hence scalable from worse to better or from inferior to superior? Let's call this the developmental interpretation of difference. And how is that scaling to be done? Here, allow me to clarify what I mean by a moral judgment. I mean a judgment applied to an issue having existential significance that can be expressed in the following form. In situation S, person P ought to behave in such and such a way because it's the right thing to do. And it's the right thing to do because that behavior by that person in that situation promotes some absolute good, for example, loyalty or justice, and makes manifest or instantiates one of the undeniable rules of moral reason. For example, that one should protect the vulnerable who are in one's charge. Here, a normative judgment is being offered about the way local social norms or the social order are connected to, make manifest, or a part of the moral order. But first, let me unpack that definition of a moral judgment. I invite you to think of the anthropology of morality as the study of the fate of moral absolutes in history and culture. And I'd like to suggest that what I just referred to as moral absolutes come in three kinds. First, there exists a base set of genuinely self-evident, undeniably valid, and hence universally binding rules of moral reason. At least in their abstract form, they are not social or personal inventions. They are not the creations of either a second person or first person subjective point of view. Just as the mathematical intuition Two parallel lines cannot enclose a square. Immediately and without the need for deliberation or thoughtful reflection commands our respect as obviously true, so too the rules of moral reason. Their validity is immediately obvious and goes without saying. There's no need to provide a justification for treating like cases alike and different cases differently, or for protecting the vulnerable who are in one's charge. We instantly acknowledge the moral authority of the rule, and there is really nothing more to say. These are the kinds of third-person rules of reason, which 19th century and early 20th century moral philosophers called moral intuitions. They are objective, not subjective. They possess more than that illusory air of self-evidence that is the commonplace atmosphere surrounding socially conditioned routines or habits. These moral absolutes are not illusory. They are known to be valid without the need for deliberation, and deliberating about their validity is pointless. They are not contestable. Unlike the many second-person declarations we assume to be self-evidently true, simply because they are our declarations or because they are familiar or popular ways of doing things in our social world. For example, for members of this or that social world, that it is self-evident that married couples ought to sleep in the same bed at night, or that it's self-evident that boys ought to get circumcised when they reach adolescence. Here are some examples of the absolute or objective rules of moral reason I have in mind. That one ought to give every person their due. Treat like cases alike and different cases differently. Impartially apply rules of general applicability. Protect those who are vulnerable and in one's charge. Respond to the urgent needs of others if the sacrifice or cost to oneself is slight. Secondly, there is a base set of universal existential issues. These are social existence questions of great significance that must be answered in one way or another if one is to have and sustain a way of life or create any cultural tradition at all. Being existential questions, they cannot be escaped. Because they are unavoidable questions, they are universal. Here are some examples of universal existential issues. The question of personal boundaries, what is me and what is not me? The question of sex identity, what is male and what is female? The question of hierarchy, how should the burdens and benefits of life be distributed and why? The question of in-group versus out-group differentiation. Who is of my kind and who is not of my kind? Who can I trust and who can I not trust? Thirdly, there's the domain of objective values or goods. These plural goods, these desire-worthy, inherently valuable ends in themselves, can be classified based on their differential saliency across moral heritage communities or across institutions and status relationships within a community. For example, the values of the military versus the values of the academy, or the values that govern marketplace relationship versus the values that govern kinship relationships. And those plural goods can be correlated with other features of self-culture and society in those communities. Schemes have been induced for comparative research on moral judgments. For example, the so-called big three of morality, the ethics of autonomy, the ethics of community, and the ethics of divinity, or so-called moral foundations theory. Classified within such schemes are values or goods such as safety or freedom from harm, justice, and equality, theorized as autonomy-supporting values in the service of a preference-seeking self. Duty, hierarchy, respect, interdependency, sacrifice, and loyalty, theorized as community-supporting values in the service of a social status-maintaining self. And sacred order, purity, sanctity, and cleanliness, theorized as divinity-supporting values in the service of a self that feels connected to some higher transcendental realm. Nevertheless, all of those moral absolutes or universals, the rules of moral reason, for example, you ought to treat like cases alike and different cases differently. The significant existential issues, for example, how should burdens and benefits be distributed? What is male and what is female? And the objective values or goods, for example, loyalty, are given shape and substance, particularized and made concrete locally, not universally. Thus, the fate of moral absolutes in history is that they are implemented selectively and made manifest and instantiated in distinctly local, context-sensitive ways, resulting in different moral mentalities and various moral traditions. And that is where the problem of understanding and interpreting any particular moral heritage tradition comes face to face with the classic and long-standing anthropological problem of how to interpret cultural differences, and with the choice between two major alternative ways of doing so, pluralistic and developmental. In a recent essay titled "The Prosecution of Dawoodi Bohra Women, Some Reasonable Doubts," my description of the Dawoodi Bohra gender equal circumcision tradition is drawn from that essay, which is currently available open access online and will be a target essay in the journal Global Discourse in a special issue of the journal on the theme Gender Equality in Abrahamic Circumcision, Why or Why Not? I have made the following normative argument about gender inclusive circumcision among the Dawoodi Bohra. To the extent the Dawoodi Bohra custom of circumcising girls as well as boys, A, has broad support among Dawoodi Bohra women, B, is motivated by a gender equal interpretation of the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 17 of the Hebrew Bible, traceable to the views and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, C, is less physically invasive than illegal male circumcision as practiced by Jews and Muslims, and additionally, there is scant evidence of serious harms associated with the procedure. It seems reasonable to suggest that space should be made in any liberal, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multicultural society for this particular long-standing family-like custom. When and if those four conditions hold, the custom is arguably protected by principles of religious liberty, family privacy, parental rights, and equal protection for both females and males before the law. It remains to be seen whether that spirit of pluralistic tolerance is still alive and well in liberal democracies such as our own, or in anthropology for that matter. Reflecting on that normative argument, it now seems to me it is informed in one way or another by all the conceptions of anthropology's value that I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much. That's the end of the talk.